Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar. It's 12 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So today we'll be talking about building event-driven workflows with Salesforce. So that's using Trigger Mesh to connect to Salesforce in order to pull events from Salesforce and also send events to Salesforce. My name is Chris Parlett. So I'm a senior solutions architect here at Trigger Mesh. We are distributed all over the world. Our company is. I am in Silver Spring, Maryland, so I'm just outside of Washington, D.C. You can see some of my contact information there. Feel free to reach out, email me, send me, stupid stuff on Twitter. That's great. Follow me on Instagram. You can watch me do dumb lifting videos in my basement or post pictures of my dogs. Those are probably the two main things I do. And proof that I do own a suit. This is from my cousin's wedding at a golf course recently. So anyway, that's my wife and I. And so just thought I'd throw that in there just because it's always boring to not have pictures in there. And also feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to chat with you, find out more about what you're doing and just kind of talk tech. You can also see some other links down there at the bottom. So triggermesh.com obviously is our main website. So you can go there, find out more information. And then Trigger Mesh is fully open source, right? So you can go to github.com/triggermesh, which is our organization, /Trigger Mesh, which is the project or the repo. And you can find all our code there. Download everything, figure things out. You can contribute back. You can open issues, so feel free to connect with us on there. Also, the other thing I'll mention, I didn't put this in the slide. If you go to our main website, we actually have a little Slack icon at the top, and that's a community Slack. So feel free to join us. A bunch of our developers there ready to chat, if you need a hand setting things up or getting connected. Cool. So what I want to do, I know this is the point of this is Salesforce. I want to give a quick background on Trigger Mesh. This is going to be the 5-minute version of kind of what Trigger Mesh does, just to make sure everyone's understanding what we do and how we're connecting these things. So really the point of Trigger Mesh is to, connect all your various things, right? So you have cloud providers, and a lot of time, I think multi-cloud was always kind of this, funny thing a couple of years ago, but now it's like you probably use multiple clouds, right? I mean, even in my personal life, I end up using multiple clouds, as well as SaaS platforms, which, Salesforce is one of them. And so we're going to be talking about that, but other SaaS platforms that you can connect to, chat tools like Slack, Twilio, Google Docs, Kafka, I mean, even on-prem or old mainframe stuff, IBM MQ. So there's all the stuff that you have in your environment. If you're an organization that's been around for a while, you definitely have a ton of stuff, right? So what Trigger Mesh is trying to do is connect these things together, pass data between them, run serverless functions, and all this on top of Kubernetes. So Kubernetes has been kind of the platform that everyone is building on top of. And we're no different, right? So we're on top of Kubernetes. So you get all the benefits of Kubernetes, meaning you can run it anywhere. It scales automatically, it uses the cluster. We get all those benefits of Kubernetes and then some, right? So we get also all the benefits of serverless technology. So scaling to zero, running any function you want, any language you want, and running as many as you need to in order to process things. So we get all the benefits for serverless, all the benefits of Kubernetes, and we do a lot of the plumbing for you so you can write these apps, develop these integrations. So, a couple of the advantages here. Again, I'm not going to go into the weeds on this, but one thing is I already mentioned we're open source. That's a big one. We try to streamline the process of getting started, and then you can provide this as an integration platform that is declarative, meaning I can just say, here's my code of my integration. I'm going to, define this code. I'm going to check it into my repository, my GitHub repository, or whatever it might be. It's going to be a part of my CI/CD pipeline. It's extensible, so I can plug into things. I can provide these APIs to my other developers so that they can have an API that they hit and they just know what happens, right? It converts XML to JSON, or it does some kind of transformation, or even just passes the data to Slack or to SQS or whatever it might be, right? So, having these benefits here, again, on top of Kubernetes, so you get the benefits of that. It's serverless, so you get the benefits of that. And then Trigger Mesh has a bunch of these connectors. So connecting to, again, all these different cloud providers, Google, Azure, AWS, Oracle, we can send things to all those different ones, as well as these other SaaS platforms. So the architecture here. So one of the things I want to talk about here is we're going to be talking specifically about Salesforce today. So I'm going to kind of gloss over some of the details in here that aren't relevant to Salesforce, but there's a couple pieces here. So you can see on the right side our architecture diagram. So we have, you can generally think of when you build these bridges in Trigger Mesh, a bridge is basically a connection between two things, right? So you're going to have an event source, you're going to have stuff happening in the middle, and then you're going to have the event target, right? So we're going to be taking things from the event source, which can be Salesforce. We're going to do something with it, and then we're going to pass it somewhere else. Now, the target can be Salesforce. Typically, you're not going to go Salesforce to Salesforce, probably, although you could if you wanted to. But generally, what you're going to do is you're going to have kind of two different modes here. You're going to be reading off of Salesforce to send this data to something else. So that might be a case where your sales team or your customer relations team is using Salesforce CRM as the source of truth. And they're like, we're updating Salesforce with everything, right? Which is a great idea. If you're going to use Salesforce, you go all in, you have everything in Salesforce. That's your contacts, your accounts, your notes, your cases, all this stuff, right? So as things get updated in there, that can be the source of truth, and it can trigger other things, right? So you can have any changes, any new items that come in to Salesforce, you can have it pass through the trigger mesh processing to take the event, pass it on, do something else. Maybe it initiates some kind of process on your internal tools. Maybe it initiates or stores something in S3 so you have long-term data storage. You can do those kinds of things. The other way, if you flip that around, if you have some kind of external data source and you want to make sure it gets into Salesforce, Salesforce can be the target. And so you can take this data from IBM MQ, or you can have your internal app that you use that customers are using. If they click a button and to sign up, it can pass that to Salesforce from us, right? So there's a lot of different connections here, but generally the two ways you're going to use Salesforce are as a source of data, and it's going to do things with it, or you're going to use it as a destination so that you keep Salesforce up to date based on other stuff that's happening, right? So those are the kind of the two ways. And in the middle there, you can do all sorts of things. You can do transformations, you can write Python scripts or JavaScript, or you can use our internal, processing language. You can also do things like call it a Lambda function. You can split events based on what the account is in Salesforce. You can split it and do different things with it, right? Or filter, or have all sorts of different things. So there's a lot of things you can do in the middle. So I don't want to, say that you can't do anything, right? You can do almost anything in the middle. But really what we're going to be talking about today is Salesforce as a source and Salesforce as a target. So I'm going to show you a couple different examples here of basically using, so this first one over on the left side is going to be using a Salesforce source, right? So we're getting that data, and we're going to just show that in Event Viewer so you can kind of see what a Salesforce event looks like. We're also going to be sending things from a webhook, right? So we're just going to be sending a curl request, which is just going to imitate what it could be anything, right? It could be any other source of information, but a webhook is easy to test. And so we're going to send a webhook to Salesforce, and we're going to show what it looks like when you create or update an object in Salesforce from a webhook, which is nice. And then that transformation, so you can do things like, Salesforce expects a certain format of the data. So I'll show you how you can kind of use a transformation in the middle there. But this transformation really, again, it can be anything you want it to be. So there's definitely some cool things we can do there. So let's jump into the demo, because that's what I like to do more frequently. So one thing I'm going to mention here over on the Trigger Mesh documentation, so docs.triggermesh.io, here's where we go through all of the details on how to connect to Salesforce. So what we use at Trigger Mesh is a certificate-based authentication into Salesforce. So what you can do is, if you come in here and you go to the enterprise section, I'm going to go ahead and make this bigger. So we're in the enterprise section of the documentation. If you go to sources or targets, it's going to have the same information because but the connection's the same, whether it's a source or a target. And so you can see a bunch of our stuff in here. I'm going to specifically go down to Salesforce. So here it has all of the details on setting this up. It's more details than you'd ever want, but this is great because this tells you exactly what you need to do in order to set this up. So, creating the certificate, it has the command to do that. So you generate a certificate, and then you basically, on Salesforce, you're going to use App Manager. So it's going to be a new connected app is what this is going to connect as, right? So when you set up this connected app, again, there's a lot of details in here about, the configuration settings, because, Salesforce requires certain configuration in order to make this work. So I've already kind of had this set up so that you don't have to watch me, click around a UI just to check some boxes. The important thing here, though, is that you're going to be putting that certificate in the cert in, and you're going to keep the key, right? So it's the private key. And you're going to use that key to connect, but the cert is going to be given to Salesforce, right? And then you're going to have a bunch of scopes and authentication details and policies and all this stuff, right? So there's a lot of details in here on what you need to do. And it's going to spit out a consumer key, right? So this is Salesforce, that connected app. It creates a consumer key for you. So, right. So you, I know it's confusing having multiple keys here. So you're going to create the cert. It's going to have a cert in a key file, right? You're going to give the cert to Salesforce. Salesforce is going to say, okay, fine, here's the consumer key. So now you're going to have the certificate key and the consumer key. You're going to have both of those, and you're going to use those to connect to this connected app, right? Programmatically. So that's kind of how we're going to set it up. And there's more details in here too. This is important, but it goes through, here's the different kind of event streams that come off of Salesforce. And so there's different topics and different events that Salesforce can split out. We're going to focus on this change data capture event, just because I think that's the most relevant to what most people are trying to do with it, in the sense of, hey, when an account gets updated or when a contact record gets updated, you want to do something with that information, right? So that's part of the important bit. But you can also do things like, hey, all these different push topics and platform events and all sorts of stuff. So if you guys have, some Salesforce admins who are like, hey, I want to track this information or do something with this, we can definitely read that information. The other thing I'll show off here is if I come over to, again, I'm going to go to enterprise and go to targets. Here's where, again, if I go to Salesforce target, a lot of this is going to be the same. It's like, hey, if you haven't made this connection yet, here's how to make the connection, right? So all this looks very familiar. And then when we get down here, this is where it's going to say, okay, we have event types. So this is where the Salesforce API is expecting certain formatting of events. And so we're going to show how you can send that yourself. And then also how you can use a transformation to modify it in order to show it as this specific format, right? So it goes through some of the formats down here. And so this is important as you're kind of building out these integrations. You can see here's some examples of, here's what an event looks like to create a new account, right? So the object is account, it has a name. So you can post this, and you can also update things. So here's updating an account with a new billing city, right? So you can do that kind of thing. You can also do gets, and you can do deletes. So again, this is the Salesforce API that we're interfacing with. So this is important though, because as we're sending this data, you want to make sure we're posting the right messages and updating the right records. Cool. So let's jump into what this kind of looks like. So what I have here, I'm going to make this first 2/3. Here we go. Cool. So I've got some information. So what I did is I installed Minikube. So, and we're not going to go through the details here, but basically what I did here, and we actually have a blog post about this. So my setup here is just local on my laptop. And so you can see I did a Knative installation. It's one of the prerequisites here. So we're going to install Knative serving. It installs Courier as a networking. And then we're doing some local DNS here, and then Knative eventing. And then here's a trigger mesh install. So one of the cool things is, trigger mesh installation is basically 2 commands. I have some waits in here just to wait for it all to finish. But it's basically you install the CRDs and then you install the trigger mesh YAML. And then this is where I actually added the secret. So I already made the cert, and then I created the Salesforce app. So I've already done that connection. So what I did was I created a secret in Kubernetes. And basically, I just called it Salesforce secret. And I just said, okay, the cert key is going to be this is the output from that command I ran to create the certificate. So I created a cert file and a key file. This is the key file. So basically what I'm saying is, okay, I'm storing this key file as a secret so I can connect to the cert that I uploaded to Salesforce, right? So I've already created that secret. So now I can reference the Salesforce secret in my manifests. That way I don't have to put secret information in the manifests. So I could check the manifest into, my GitHub repo, and I don't have secrets stored in there, right? So let's look at what I have here. So I have the Sockeye event viewer. So all this is doing is it's going to show the output of events. And then I have created a Salesforce source. So this is what a Salesforce source looks like. You can see the kind here is Salesforce source. Salesforce source. And I give it a name. And then here's where I subscribed. I mentioned there's different event channels. So I'm getting the change events. So that's specifically what I'm reading off of is anytime a change happens to an account or contact or anything like that, basically I'm going to get the events, right? Here's all of the authentication. So this is that client ID. So this is what Salesforce gave me. And then I'm going to use the cert key. Again, I'm using the value from the secret. Here's the Salesforce secret and the cert key. So basically what I'm referencing that in order to do the authentication. So I have my user information in here and then sync. So anytime you create any of these manifests where you say, where do you want the event to go? Now, sometimes that is to a transformation. Sometimes that is to a broker. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm sending it directly to my event viewer called Sockeye. So this is basically just saying, hey, anything that comes from Salesforce, I want to post it to Sockeye, right? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to come in here. I have my records in here. I have a contact. You can see their phone number is 55555, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify this. I'm just going to edit this. I'm going to change my phone number here to 12345, and we're going to save it. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to create an event in Salesforce. We are connected to that event stream, the change event stream. And so here is actually a cloud event that has the payload from Salesforce. So we're going to kind of look through this a little bit. First off, what is a cloud event? Cloud event is a spec, a CNCF specification. So cloud event just defines, you can really think of it, if you haven't worked with cloud events before, it's basically, okay, you have this data and then you have attributes. And in the attributes, you have things like, here's the ID, we made this up. Here's the source. You can see adapter data change events, right? So that's the stream that we're pulling off of Salesforce. Here's the subject as contact update. So we updated a contact record. And so Salesforce sent that and said, okay, here's what happened. It's a contact update. Here's what time it happened. Here's the type. This is Salesforce stream message. The reason I want to highlight this is most of the time, if you're doing, I mentioned you can do filtering, routing, splitting, trigger things off of events that you get inside of Trigger Mesh. Most of the time, you're going to trigger off of this type. So I just want to highlight this because if you said, you know what, I'm getting a bunch of Salesforce events and I want to say, do something with it, but it's in the middle of all my other Trigger Mesh flows and bridges, I can just say, okay, if it's from a Salesforce stream message, I'm going to do something with it, right? And then, I might be able to transform it, modify it, send it on to something else, something like that. So I just want to highlight that you can kind of filter on this specific thing. And then here's the actual data. So you can see the payload from Salesforce is a little big, but they send a bunch of stuff to you, right? And then you can kind of see what they did. So one of the things I want to highlight here, so a lot of the stuff is kind of based off here. You can see the phone number 12345. That's what we put in, right? And then you can see here is the changed fields. So these are the two fields that changed. So again, if you want to do some kind of filtering on what actually got updated, here's where you might say, okay, if phone is in the change fields, then do something with that, right? Maybe you want to trigger some kind of calling service or your sales team needs to know that, right? So you can do that. And then here's where record IDs. So this is the ID of the actual contact. And the only reason I've mentioned this is because when you're doing things like, if you're actually using Salesforce as a target, you often need a record ID of what you're trying to update, right? So this is important because you can't just say, I want to update some, contact to ASDF. That probably isn't, that's not how you do the Salesforce API. So what you need typically is this record ID, right? So I just want to highlight that as well. Cool. So that's how easy it is to get a Salesforce event in, right? So now we have Salesforce sending us events as a source. And now, again, it's coming into Trigger Mesh. Right now, we're just passing it on to the event viewer, but you could do other things with it. So now let's show what it looks like to actually send an event to Salesforce. So we're going to come up here. We're going to take a look at our Salesforce target. This is going to look very similar because, again, it's the same connection details. You got the cert key, you got the name, you got the client ID, right? So here's the authentication. And basically, it's going to expect you to do a lot of the sending the right formatted data. So what I set up here, I set up a webhook. So this is a webhook source. So what this means is we now have a webhook, a URL that it gives us that is in Trigger Mesh And you can see the sync here is Salesforce target. Now I've sent the event type here to Salesforce API call. So this is important because it's expecting that to send. And here's the sync. So we just have a webhook ready to go. So what I'm going to do, I have a payload here. You can see here's the contact ID. That should be the same thing, right? So the end here is FFAA3. You can see this is the contact ID. Here's the subject. You know what? I'm going to change this to webinar. Here's some. So what we're actually sending in here is a post, meaning we're creating a new thing. Resources S object. Object is a case. So we're going to open a case on this contact record. And if you haven't worked with case before, it's like if you do support tickets or anything like that, it's just a support ticket kind of thing, right? So we're going to open a case that's attached to this contact, and the contact ID is this ID. Here's the subject of the case is webinar, priority medium, status new, right? So this is just details about the case. When you create the case, this is what it's expecting. And here is my webhook URL, right? So if you have this as a part of your EKS cluster or something like that, you might have your own DNS resolving. The way I found this actually is if I do kubectl get KSVC, what should happen is we are seeing, here's some of our stuff, right? So we have the Salesforce target, sockeye, here's the webhook source. So here's the URL, right? So I can basically just grab this URL and basically, use this to send my data. So here's a curl command. So I'm going to basically send this data. And what's going to happen is it's going to update Salesforce. The interesting part is since it updates Salesforce, we have the connection set up where Salesforce is a source, it's actually going to show up in Sockeye as well, because we're sending to Salesforce. Salesforce creates the case. Then Salesforce is like, hey, there's a new case and someone's subscribing to my event stream, my data change events. I'm going to send that back to them, right? So we're going to go ahead and send this. And so it's going to create the case, and you can see here's the details of the created case. It popped up in here, right? So you can see case create. Now, real quick before we show this, I'm going to come over here. So here's my cases. And if I do refresh, there we go. So these are the two ones I did earlier today. And then here's case. So subject webinar, you can see the priority medium, status new. So this is the case we just created, right? So I just sent this in here. And then here's the details on this. Again, here's some of the payload. So we have, account ID, contact ID, owner ID, so this is all the details that you might need, something like the account ID, but the contact ID is the same one that we already had. And you can see status, new, priority, medium, subject webinar. So these are all the details that we sent in, right? And then it has, some of the change event stuff. Here's the actual, this is the record ID of the case itself. So this is what it looks like from Salesforce again. So we send it to Salesforce, it created a case. Then Salesforce is like, oh, I got an updated case. I got to send that to whoever's subscribing to this. So we sent it back, and now we see that in Sockeye. So it's nice just to see that as kind of a more like a debug thing, but that way you can kind of see what's happening. Now, what I mentioned earlier was you could also use a transformation to get this data. So what that looks like in Trigger Mesh is, if I come over here, this is what a transformation looks like. I'm not going to go through the full, deploying and running this transformation, but we have this transformation kind in Trigger Mesh, right? So it is a part of the flow, and you can read off of a specific broker. So you can send things to a broker and read off of it. And then here's where you actually modify the data, right? So we're actually taking the transformation. So let's go through a couple of these examples. So what this is saying is we're shifting the type. So the type of the event, regardless of what it is, I'm shifting it to be the value be IO Trigger Mesh Salesforce API call. That, because again, that's what Salesforce wants. I can take the case subject of what it sends me, and then I can do things like add the action as post. I can add the resource as S objects. I can add the object as case. Payload is contact ID is this certain field, right? Status is new. Subject is what we sent in. So we're building out, let me pull up the curl command here. We're building out this whole thing. But what you can do is if you have that transformation, you can send in something like this. So it's just a JSON that says, hello, Trigger Mesh case. and you could send this. The transformation then creates this whole payload, right? So it builds out the action post, the resource S objects. So Trigger Mesh can do that for you. And that way, if your custom app just spits out a JSON and you don't want to modify a custom app to send this whole thing as Salesforce, Trigger Mesh can do the modification for you. Now, this is just one way of doing it. You can also do a transformation that runs a Python script. So if you're more familiar with that, or if you're a developer who works in Go, you can deploy a Go application that runs this. So since it's all containerized, you can basically run any transformation script you want. But we do have a native one here that you can also run. So we try to make this as easy as possible and flexible as possible so that you can do as much, as you need to. Cool. So I appreciate everyone taking the time today. So again, that's kind of how you can use Salesforce as a source and as a target. I think this is really important for if your organization is already, using something like Salesforce, and you want to say, look, all the records always need to be up to date, and all the records are always up to date, meaning I can use that data to my advantage for other sources, as a source to kind of send along to do other things. I think this is really helpful for integrating into that Salesforce ecosystem. And again, we connect to a lot of other things. So you can use Salesforce as one of your sources or targets, and it can connect to other things. SQS is a popular one. Azure has, some queue systems or even blob storage or things like that. I mean, there's so many different options and the transformations that you can build these workflows and build more complex patterns. So that a lot of this is automated so that you don't have to do kind of manual updating of records in Salesforce, or you don't have to manually do things once a Salesforce record is updated. So I appreciate you guys taking the time today. We're going to be doing these monthly, so we'll let you know as the next topic gets announced. But, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Again, email, we have that community Slack. Visit our website and check it out. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Love to talk to you and find out more about your use cases. So I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks.